an outlier in the OECD as the only country in the OECD that doesn't have a form of wealth tax, inheritance tax, or even a capital gains tax or stamp duty.
None of any of those?
None of those.
Okay.
And the political debate is so bloody constrained. It is so frustrating because whenever we try to talk about fixing those scales right, there's this kind of appeal to, like, in some ways, this imported notion of the American dream, or this bizarre reference back to how, in our heads we're egalitarian, whereas very clearly in experience and evidence we're not.
So I think a lot of British people probably do have that kind of perception of New Zealand, which is that it's more equal. Perhaps that living standards are in some ways better.
We've got a lot of nature.
But it's interesting to hear then if you actually, from what you just described, the tax system of New Zealand is even worse from an equality perspective than the tax system of the UK. And my sort of big...
I should also say, the first part of this, before we got to this, Chloe had just talked to Gary about that IRD report where 311 families, own 60 or 40 or whatever percent it is of the wealth, and pay half the equivalent tax of everybody else. So that's where this part of the conversation has come from, which is why Gary's saying, shit, sounds like you guys are worse. So we'll keep going.
Is even worse from an equality perspective than the tax system of the UK. And my sort of big idea, which I always push here on this channel, is if you don't tax rich people, what will happen is they will accumulate a lot of money very quickly. And
it's funny when Gary talks about this, he talks about this kind of idea that could happen. I would suggest you listen to this and think about New Zealand, because it is happening. It's not like, well, if this happens, this could happen and this could happen. It's like, this is happening, so this is happening and this is happening.
They'll use that to buy the assets. And what you'll start seeing is house prices going up, housing becoming less affordable. So I went on the radio yesterday to do like a call-in, taking calls. Actually on Tom Swarbrick's show, another Swarbrick, 2 Swarbricks in 2 days.
We're not related as far as I'm aware.
And Tom said to me, this is like quite a well-known radio host here, he said housing is more affordable in other countries. And I said, where? And he didn't say New Zealand, but he said Australia. So you're coming here telling me that the tax situation in New Zealand is even worse. What's the housing affordability situation?
It's cooked, mate. So on some metrics, we'd have some of the most unaffordable housing.
You gotta love her, eh? She's in an interview with one of the biggest economist podcasters in the world as a representative of our government or country. It's cooked, mate. Simple as that. It's cooked, mate.
In the world, and part of the reason that right now house prices are stabilising despite the current government's best efforts with giving tax breaks out to landlords and changing the bright line test by which people end up paying taxes, we are now seeing a stabilising or a slight reduction, but that's despite the government's best efforts. So we've got quite a conservative government at the moment. Some economists have characterised our economy as more of a housing market with bits tacked on the side. And I think that this kind of is part and parcel of what we were talking about before with how this kind of inequality compounds, right? Is people are working so damn hard. So many regular people are working so damn hard as house prices has escalated before their very eyes over the last, few decades. And now regular people are having to rely on what's colloquially known as the bank of mum and dad in order to get into their first house. Okay. And that then kind of creates this cultural norm where nobody wants to create a situation where it's seen that housing would end up being taxed. Yeah. So the problem continues to perpetuate and we end up in this kind of parasitic feedback loop, which is squashing regular hardworking people.
This is really, it reminds me so much of what's happening here, which is you have this situation where, because the rich are not taxed, they're accumulating all this money. And that pushes house prices up in an obvious way because you are competing with them to buy the houses, They don't need to buy them themselves, they can just lend the money for the mortgages. If you have these guys who are sitting on the side and they're going to buy anything that has a return of,
just
5%, unless the house price is above here, they're going to buy it. So you have to pay this enormous amount. But then what you get is this kind of perverse reaction, which is because people know then that unless you own wealth, you're like totally screwed. They then become resistant to the taxation of wealth. And my big challenge here is to try to communicate to people, if you don't tax the wealth of the very rich, you are the one who's going to be squeezed out. You're not going to beat them in that game. And one of the
That's a
reasons
genius thing to remember as well. And this is why we always think about people voting out against their own self-interest. If you don't tax the very rich, then it's you, us normies, that are going to be the ones that get squeezed out. And when we listen, Ash, to David Seymour, and he gets asked questions like, if 10% of the population controls 50% of the wealth, is that a problem? And he goes about how it's not a problem and X, Y, Z. And the reason is because the way that David Seymour's thinking about it is sort of intangible and like an idea that it's an unlimited resource. Like this is so if people want to be rich, go and get. But when you're talking about, for example, housing's not an unlimited resource. So if you bring those numbers of wealth across to that, if 10% of the households own 50% of the homes, you can't just go out and continue to buy because there's a limited number. They're in that street. It's not like an idea, or it sounds like crypto coins that seem to be unlimited. But if there is a tangible limited amount of the resource, then this matters heaps. Because if a small percentage controls a large number, then what happens is the bottom control none, which is what they're sort of talking about.
Right.
Any thoughts?
Oh, sorry. I thought we were going to press play. Any thoughts? Oh, lots of thoughts. We definitely should be taxing the rich. This is an interesting discussion that I'm glad to see start happening more, because I want to learn a lot more about capital gains tax and why we don't do that and what more could be done for us to be able to do that, because we're busy trying to move money around between these different services and different funds, and who can we take to give over here, where really if we just had a proper taxing system, then we'd have enough money to go around, with the hopes of that likely.
Yeah, and this is that lie that we keep getting told about millionaire migration. If we introduce a capital gains tax, they're going to leave. Yeah, and then they're going to go to a country with either a capital gains tax, a wealth tax, or inheritance tax. So they're not going to leave because of a CGT, especially if the government gets in and does it based on, like, not the family home, but whatever, because all these other countries, as Chloe just said, and this is why I think Gary's like, what? You got nothing? They all do it. We're the haven at the moment. Where are you going to go to not get either a CGT or a inheritance tax or a wealth tax? You're not going to go anywhere else, because all of our unless you want to go to a third world country that's not going to be like-minded. But if you're going to go to a like-minded country, they've all got something within that tax frame.